Hello and welcome to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will cover the different opinions in relation to the rights of individuals versus the rights of society. Western liberal democracies focus greatly on individual rights, such as the right to free speech, right to freedom of movement, etc. Recent situations, however, such as the migrant crisis in Europe and the disagreements in wide-reaching lockdowns to slow the spread of coronavirus, have highlighted the need to create a clear relationship between the rights of individuals and the rights of society. The aim of this podcast is not to try and show either side to be correct or more convincing, but rather to showcase each side and provide a comparison between them. While this topic extends to many specific examples and scenarios, in the interest of time, I will be keeping it limited to the wider reaching arguments with a few examples to help explain viewpoints. I will begin by going over the arguments that the rights of society take precedent over those of the individual, followed by the counter-arguments in favour of individuals, and will then conclude with a comparison of the main points. For the argument that society takes precedent over the individual, most of these arguments revolve around the idea of the common good, which is essentially the idea that what benefits the most amount of people should be what occurs. It is hard to argue that what benefits a smaller group of individuals or just a smaller group of people compared to a larger group should take precedent over what benefits a much larger incorporation of individuals. Perhaps the main ideology in favour of this viewpoint is that of utilitarianism. Utilitarians aim to maximise pleasure and minimise displeasure. A simplified explanation of this ideology is that they support what does the most good for the most people, and they would advocate that whatever benefits the most people benefits society as a whole more so. In a more quantitative approach, similar to utilitarians, essentially there's this comparison. For example, if you have a group of 10 people and a group of 5 people, if you choose the decision for the group of 10 people over that of the group of 5 people, there is more total good done by favouring the larger group, and therefore that is the approach that we should take. This, however, ignores the idea of compromise, which is a wide-reaching viewpoint, which is essentially that society incorporates many diverse and competing interests, and as such, not everyone can always be pleased. And this is where the idea of compromise comes into play, essentially that with compromise between groups, the most amount of good can be achieved. People should put aside their self-interests and do what benefits everyone as a whole. And a good example of this is one of the arguments around wearing masks to prevent the spread of coronavirus. While some people don't like wearing masks, they may not like having the feel of it or their breathing being restricted, they should compromise and wear one despite the discomfort to protect society and prevent a greater spread of the virus. Cooperation for the common good requires effort and participation from all sides, but it can be achieved with very simple things, and therefore in a great number of scenarios it's very easy to advocate for societal needs over individual needs. For example, if you don't litter in a park, yes, you may want to litter and you have to go out of your way to go to a bin, but if everyone doesn't litter and puts their rubbish where it should be, it protects parks for everyone to enjoy. The culture that perhaps supports this the most is that of the Far East in countries such as China and Japan, which advocate collective good over individualism far more than Western societies do. These cultures essentially advocate doing your part for everyone and therefore support rights of society over individuals. Another ideology that supports this viewpoint is nationalism, and essentially the crux of nationalism is that everyone should do their part to defend their nation. Therefore, nationalists advocate the value of the collective. This, in the most extreme example, can apply to, for example, fighting and dying to defend your country, and this was a message used to rally recruits for armies in World War I and II. Another viewpoint is that individuals owe something to society. Society provides people with security, healthcare, education, and so many other useful benefits, and therefore you owe it to an extent to do your part to not harm society due to your own individual greed. Another critical argument is that of time, which is essentially that society exists far beyond the individual, So while a human may die, society will continue and will last for much longer, and therefore it should be protected to a greater extent than the individual. Another argument is that of the intrinsic value of society versus an individual. While, for example, while utilitarians are practical in their approach to society in regards to how much pleasure and displeasure is caused, others may take more ethical and moral considerations, essentially that society is bigger than any individual. Society is a collection of lots of individuals, and therefore it has more intrinsic value than an individual does. On the point of security, although without going into too many examples, essentially the idea that individual security is not as important as societal security, and as such, the individual rights of people could arguably be constrained in order to protect society as a whole. Moving on now to an economic standpoint, the most extreme view of this is socialism, which is essentially that the economy should benefit everyone and not just be towards a smaller group of people who benefit more, and therefore they would advocate taxes to protect everyone, to ensure that there's enough money to go around, responsibility to redistribute, to make sure everyone has their basic needs provided for, and essentially this viewpoint that the economy as a part of society exists for everyone and not just the people who make the most money, and therefore they would advocate more redistribution. Another area that often comes into play, although not a specific argument, is this idea of more trivial right. This is an argument portrayed by a lot of Eastern countries when compared to Western countries, and essentially that although individuals must be protected, their rights, at least some of their rights, are not as important as they make out to be. So for example, the right not to wear a mask, that's something being pushed by a lot of people, particularly in America, and that doesn't affect your standard of living. It doesn't, to a great extent, change the way you live your life beyond a minor inconvenience, and therefore rights like that shouldn't be taken into consideration, and therefore a lot of individual rights can be argued to be on a much lower pedestal than societal rights. And finally, if you're looking at just numbers, a good example of this is immigration, essentially that the rights of the society receiving the immigrants are greater than the rights of the individual immigrants, because there are more people, it's their life being affected too, and essentially they should have a greater say in the matter because they're the ones who will be affected the most. And these societal arguments essentially all stem around the same idea that society is just in some way, for whatever reason, more important and worth more than the individual, and therefore should be prioritised. Moving on now to the rights of the individual over the rights of society. Essentially, this idea that the common good is a dangerous topic, and it can be used to reject individuals and make them disposable. A good example of this can be Nazis in World War II. They were claiming that to protect the individual and for the greater good of Germany, groups such as the Jews and Gypsies can be discarded and eradicated in whatever form that may be, and therefore it's essentially common good can be used to just make people disposable. And then there's this idea of what is the common good, and there's a view shared by a lot of people that it's an idea created by those in power to protect their position and interests, essentially that they will frame the common good to be whatever outcome favours them the most. Similar to this, we have this idea of tyranny of the majority, which essentially that while society must be defended, it shouldn't come at the cost of all those who don't fit into the wider realm. So to go back to the example of the group of 10 versus a group of 5, there are still 5 people who are going to suffer if you only benefit the group of 10. And therefore individual rights should still be protected to ensure that those individuals in the minority aren't disregarded. Similar to this idea of being disposable, if you only value society, the individual becomes irrelevant very quickly, and you merely talk about society essentially as a wider, bigger concept than individuals. But a lot of people would argue that society is a collection of individuals and none is more important than the other, and therefore you shouldn't simply disregard people. There's a big counter to nationalism, essentially, that yes, you should do your part to help your country, but you shouldn't be required immediately just to give away your life because it benefits the country, especially if you're taking the viewpoint that what actually benefits them is different to what people say benefits them. Going on to this idea of minorities is essentially that those in the majority have no problem disregarding individuals in the minority, but if the situation were to be flipped around, your opinions would change, that essentially it's easy to disregard an individual until you're the one being outcast. And essentially this idea of majority view privilege, whereby if your viewpoint is the one shared by the majority of people, it's much more easy for you to disregard smaller groups. However, if the situation was reversed, you may reconsider that. A lot of neoconservatives would take this idea of atomism, which is that society is merely a group of individuals, and therefore a collection of individuals means that individual rights as a group become societal rights, and therefore individual rights are the ones that should be prioritised, because that comes down to an individual level, wherefore, as we've already said, societal rights may not include everyone, but if there's rights that each individual has, society therefore will cover all of those rights just by being there. And then, similar to neoconservatives are the idea of liberals. However, they go even further. Essentially, they prioritise the value of the individual person, and they would say that in no situation can the individual essentially be disregarded for society's benefit. Moving on then to the economy, essentially it's just the idea of capitalism, which essentially it's your work and it's your reward. In capitalist societies, you work for yourself. You don't make money because society benefits from it. You make money because you benefit from it. It's your work, it's your effort, it's your brain, and therefore you should reap the rewards of your labour. And therefore they would reject this idea that your economic responsibility primarily is towards society, whether instead it's towards yourself. This idea of essentially being risky for the greater good can be best explained for this idea of a Pandora's box, which is essentially that security for society can very quickly become something rather more extreme. For example, the George Orwell's 1984 Big Brother scenario. Essentially that society's security can quickly be used to disregard individuals, and therefore we should keep it confined in order to protect people. Extending further beyond that is essentially this idea of conformity, whereby a group of elites are making people conform to support society over the individual, because that helps maintain order. If everyone's looking for the wider good beyond themselves, they may put down some of their own personal views to support what is claimed to be in the best interest of everyone, and therefore it helps maintain the socio-economic position of those at the top while keeping people below in line. Then the counter to this idea of compromise is essentially that it's difficult for divisive issues. Often compromise can prevent change, as it's often half-hearted and is not done to the extent it needs to be. And therefore, if compromise, of course, can be done properly, then yes, go for it. But if it can't be done properly, then compromise shouldn't be incorporated, and essentially you should not just claim compromise, because often compromise can be extremely difficult and people can often get stuck and stay where they are, which extends to this idea of conformity to maintain the socio-economic position of those on top. And finally, there's this idea that essentially just individual rights which don't harm society should be allowed. So, for example, the right to sexual orientation, some may argue that that doesn't harm society. Obviously, there are those who would claim that it harms kind of social cohesion. Conservatives especially would disagree with this viewpoint, but a lot of people may push for the idea that on the intrinsic, on the more deeper level, not just a superficial, but the actual core functions of society are not affected by this, and therefore the individual shouldn't be prevented from doing it. And therefore, the individual rights that tend to stem around this idea of preventing the common good being used as an excuse for much more dangerous things, and also that often this idea of social conformity is an idea created by the majority and the ruling elite in order to ostracize people, maintain their current socio-economic position, and maintain this kind of society that they have helped create. Moving on now to the comparison between them. Essentially, the core idea is what is valued more. Those in favour of society would argue society is valued more because it lasts longer, it's made of a lot of people, there's more benefit to societal gains over individual gains. Meanwhile, individuals, those in favour of individual rights, would claim that society is a human idea, it's a collection of individuals, and therefore individuals have more value than society, as individuals are real, society is an artificial creation which is merely made to preserve those in power, and therefore the individual should be valued more. When looking at security, those valuing society would claim that protecting society outweighs the need to protect an individual, and people can be sacrificed for the greater good, essentially. Meanwhile, those supporting individual rights would claim that it's ultimately a Pandora's box, and you open it up and it becomes very risky and a means to exploit people and abuse the position of those in power to essentially suppress society and the individual. Utilitarians themselves would claim that whatever benefits the most people is good, and therefore society should take precedent, because whatever benefits society the most will thereby essentially benefit the most people within that society. Whether the counter to a lot of utilitarian claims is that humans are treated as a means and not an ends. This is essentially the idea of neoconservatives, that humans are the end, not the means, and they should be valued much more than a utilitarian would value a human, and humans are treated as a tool for something else. So they would reject that idea on the basis that utilitarians negate the importance of an individual. On the idea of compromise, those supporting society over the individual would say that compromise is necessary and allows individuals to coexist. People should put down their own selfish desires and work with others, be willing to compromise in order to benefit everyone, while those opposed to it would claim that compromise can be difficult and half-hearted, and it can prevent change, and compromise can often be used to quell more radical ideas and essentially maintain the current socioeconomic standing. In regards to disregarding individuals, those supporting society would essentially have to take the standpoint that people are not as important as society is, and they can be sacrificed, and individuals shouldn't hold back society, while those on the other side would claim that this makes people disposable. Humans have more values than those on the other side would claim they do, and that it's easy to disregard individuals when you're not the group being disregarded. Essentially the idea that those supporting the common good are the ones who would benefit most from the common good, which is, moving on now, this majority view, which is essentially that the views of most people matter the most. Essentially this idea of democracy, whereby whichever group has the largest supporting, that idea should at least take precedent over others, and if it has an outright majority, it should definitely take precedent, while those on the other side claim that this can easily lead to tyranny of the majority and this majority view privilege, where it's easy to say that you should support the majority view when you're the one in the majority view, and that this allows elitists to kind of dominate society and keep it going their way. In regards to nationalism, so those in favour of society would claim that you have to protect the nation. You have a sense of identity, but that in itself is linked to your nation, to a wider group, and it's important to protect that first, while those on the other side would claim that nationalism is often used as a means to scapegoat people. It's backwards and makes people disposable. It's often an excuse to be cruel to minority groups, and it's often just a way of those, again, in this majority view, claiming the common good in order to exert their own power and influence. Regarding a debt to society, those in favour of society would claim that if you use anything from society and benefit from it, you owe it. If you claim security, healthcare, food, whatever it may be, from society, you therefore have a responsibility to help protect that society, while those on the other side would claim that you don't have a choice, and that people can't physically escape society. The idea of security, if you live on America, you're going to maintain security from America, and wherever you move, because of the nature of states, you're always going to benefit from society, and therefore it's unfair to claim that you owe something, especially on the basis that you didn't consent to it in the first place. Regarding intrinsic value, those favouring society would argue to protect it because it lasts longer, it will stay around long after individuals have died, and it's bigger than any individual, and people need to realise that and not be selfish. But those on the other side would claim that the society is a group of individuals. Individuals are real. Society isn't real. This is almost delving into metaphysics, so I won't go into too much, but essentially this viewpoint that individuals are real and they are physical, while society is an artificial construct based off human interaction and, for lack of a better word, social cooperation, and therefore it's an artificial idea, and the individual thereby has more intrinsic value given that it is real. On the idea of the economy, essentially this is socialism versus capitalism. Socialists, of course, say you should work for everyone, share, benefit everyone as a whole, while capitalists would say you should work for yourself first, you earned it, you reap the rewards of your labour, and it shouldn't just be disregarded and given to everyone else, because that can lead to laziness and a lot of other things I won't go into now. However, that will be a future episode, so keep an eye out for that. On cultures, essentially, those from the Far East are more inclined to argue to protect society and put aside or individual needs for those of society, while those in the West, given that they're more liberal, are much more predisposed to argue that the individual should take at least some degree more precedent than those in the East would argue. And finally, just on the idea of immigration, those in favour of society would claim that you should protect the interests of those who are already present in that society, their needs should come first. While on the other side, the individual would claim that, what about if it's the other way around? If you were in their situation, you would want that bigger society to help you, and therefore you have a moral right to help the individual. Overall, there's no clear answer to this, obviously. Many countries have approached the issue of societal rights and importance versus the individual through a degree of balancing. Essentially, they try to incorporate both areas, as it's hoped that through representing them both, they can come to a means whereby both are valued equally. However, the problem arises when situations require an actual degree of qualifying of the importance between the two, and virtually no nation has actually gone out of their way to expressly clarify whether society or the individual is more important, and that's where it really comes down to the culture rather than the country itself. And beyond that, one's view on the individual versus society comes down to what their own internal values are. If they value their own freedom and rights more so, how much they value security, what their view of society is. If you view society as a collection of individuals, then you're probably more inclined to support individuals. But if you claim that society is a basic, essentially, construct of human existence, it's the most basic form of human life, then society should take precedent. This is furthered by the idea of ideology. Liberals support individuals both socially and economically, while utilitarians and socialists support society, although again for conflicting reasons. Nationalists support society. Essentially, it's liberals and neoconservatives, and then most of the ideologies would point towards society first. And ultimately, it comes down to your view of the common good. Whether the common good involves society or individuals, and the approach that you have towards both of those groups. If you value society more, of course, you'll support that more. If you value individuals more, you'll support that more. And therefore, I suppose it's going to be difficult for countries to actually clarify which would take precedent on the basis that each individual is different. And again, it comes down to culture, and it can even come down to the specific scenario, because arguably there's a big difference between you sacrificing your individual right to wear a mask and you getting rid of your individual right to commit arson because you don't like the look of a building. They're very different, but essentially there's this idea that depending on the situation, one could very clearly or not take precedent over another. But I'll put the question out to you. What do you think about this? Obviously, it's a big topic. This is the longest video by quite a distance, I can tell already. So let me know if there's anything I got wrong, missed, could do better. Let me know in the comments or on Twitter. And be sure to check back on Friday at 7 PM GMT for the different opinions on violence in video games, because I do a more niche topic after this heavy one. But anyway, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.